Dearest listeners, what is it about a mask that transforms even the meekest mouse into a lioness? This author has witnessed countless metamorphoses behind silk and velvet, but none quite so enchanting as the tale I bring you today. A story of two souls, or perhaps three, depending on how one counts, entangled in the most delicious deception of the 1818 London season. But let us not rush, for the best scandals, like the finest wine, must be savored properly. Our tale begins, as all the most intriguing stories do, in the most mundane of settings, Lady Harrington's insufferably proper Tuesday afternoon tea. There, amidst the clinking of finest china and the rustling of silk afternoon dresses, sat Miss Sophia Whitmore, a creature so unremarkable that even this author, with her keen eye for hidden treasures, had nearly overlooked her for 2 full seasons. One must paint the picture properly, gentle listeners. Miss Whitmore, our dear Sophia, possessed the kind of beauty that whispered rather than shouted. Soft brown hair that she insisted on styling in the most conservative fashion. Eyes of such a peculiar shade of amber that they seemed almost golden in candlelight, though few had the opportunity to observe this phenomenon. And a figure that, while perfectly pleasing, was perpetually hidden beneath high-necked gowns of the most modest cut imaginable. But it was not her appearance that rendered her invisible to the ton. No, dearest listeners. It was her absolutely paralyzing inability to string together more than 3 words in the presence of any gentleman under the age of 60. This author has it on good authority that during her first season she had actually fainted, yes, fainted, when the Duke of Marlborough merely asked if she enjoyed the weather. Her mother, the formidable Mrs. Whitmore, had all but given up hope. 2 seasons had passed, and Sophia remained steadfastly, hopelessly unmarried. Not for lack of dowry, mind you, the Whitmores were quite comfortable, but for lack of words. How does one secure a proposal when one cannot manage a conversation? This author has often pondered this very question. What the ton did not know, but your humble chronicler discovered through careful observation, was that Miss Sophia Whitmore possessed one of the finest minds in all of London. Behind those downcast eyes lived a young woman who read Greek and Latin with ease, who corresponded with scholars across Europe under a masculine pseudonym, and who had written 3 treatises on astronomy that would have shocked the Royal Society had they known their true author wore petticoats. But I digress. For on this particular Tuesday afternoon, as Sophia sat silently contemplating the astronomical improbability of her ever finding a husband who would appreciate her mind, fate was already setting its wheels in motion. Enter Viscount James Blackthorne. Oh, gentle listeners, how does one describe such a man without sounding like a swooning debutante? This author shall endeavor to maintain her composure, though it proves challenging. The Viscount had arrived in London just 3 weeks prior, fresh from adventures in the Indies that had left him bronzed by foreign suns and possessed of a fortune that made even the most calculating mammas forgive his lack of proper English pallor. Standing well over 6 feet, with hair the color of midnight and eyes so intensely blue they seemed almost unnatural, Lord Blackthorne moved through society like a panther among house cats. He was dangerous in that particularly delicious way that made young ladies forget their proper upbringing and their mammas reach for their vinaigrettes. But here is where our tale takes its first interesting turn, dearest listeners. For all his physical perfections and mysterious allure, Viscount Blackthorne found himself utterly, completely, and mortifyingly bored by the London marriage mart. The simpering misses with their practiced smiles and rehearsed conversations about the weather made him long for the straightforward dangers of tiger hunts and monsoons. This author learned from his valet, a delightfully chatty fellow after a few glasses of port, that the Viscount had declared he would rather return to wrestling crocodiles in Ceylon than endure another evening of insipid conversation about Lady Jersey's latest turban or the shocking width of Miss Cunningham's ribbon trim. Would you believe, dearest listeners, that their first encounter was a collision? Not the metaphorical collision of hearts, that would come later, but an actual physical impact that sent poor Sophia's teacup flying and left a rather impressive tea stain on the Viscount's impeccable white cravat. It happened thus. Lord Blackthorne, in his attempt to escape the advancing army of marriage-minded misses, had backed directly into Sophia, who had been attempting to make a stealthy exit to the library. The poor dear had spotted a rare volume of Newton's Principia on Lady Harrington's shelf and simply could not resist. The tea went everywhere. Sophia's mortification was so complete that for a moment this author feared she might actually expire on the spot. She stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, unable to produce even a squeak of apology. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the Viscount's reaction. And then, gentle listeners, the most extraordinary thing happened. Lord Blackthorne laughed, not a polite chuckle or a forced titter, but a genuine, deep, rich laugh that seemed to surprise even him. He made a theatrical flourish with his ruined handkerchief, declaring that she had accomplished what Napoleon's entire navy could not. She had defeated him utterly. One might have expected this gallantry to help matters, but poor Sophia, faced with such unexpected kindness from such an unexpected quarter, did the only thing her overwhelmed nervous system could manage. She curtsied so deeply and so quickly that she nearly toppled over, mumbled something that sounded suspiciously like astronomy instead of an apology, and fled the room as if pursued by wolves. This author must confess to following her, and found her in Lady Harrington's library, pressed against the volumes of ancient history, fanning herself with her dance card and muttering mathematical equations under her breath. Apparently, calculating probability helped calm her nerves. The Viscount, meanwhile, stood in the drawing room, staring at the doorway through which she had vanished with the most peculiar expression. His aunt later reported that he spent the remainder of the tea party inquiring about the young lady who had baptized him with Earl Grey, but no one seemed to know quite who she was. Miss Sophia Whitmore had perfected the art of being forgettable to such a degree that even after 2 seasons, half the ton could not recall her name. But Lord Blackthorne was not a man easily deterred. This author observed him making inquiries, and within 2 days, he had learned everything society knew about Miss Whitmore, which, frankly, was precious little. Quiet, bookish, shy, unmarried after 2 seasons. The Ton had written her off as a future spinster, destined to care for her parents and eventually become the type of aunt one invites to family dinners out of duty rather than pleasure. How wrong they all were, dearest listeners. How deliciously, spectacularly wrong. For that very same week, London's most exclusive and mysterious event was about to commence: the midnight masquerades at Vauxhall Gardens. Now, one must understand, these were not your typical masquerade balls. These were invitation-only affairs, where the cream of society mingled with artists, writers, and intellectuals, all hidden behind elaborate masks. The rules were simple yet revolutionary. Behind the mask, one could be anyone. Titles were forbidden, real names were prohibited, and one was free to speak, dance, and behave as their true self. This author has it on excellent authority that Miss Sophia Whitmore had been attending these masquerades for over a year, though how she managed to escape her mother's watchful eye remains a mystery even to me. At these gatherings, hidden behind a mask of midnight blue silk adorned with stars, how fitting for our astronomer, she transformed into someone else entirely. Someone who danced every dance, who engaged in spirited debates about philosophy and science, who laughed freely and spoke her mind without hesitation. She called herself Celeste at these gatherings, a private joke, as the name meant heavenly and reflected her passion for astronomy. And as Celeste, she had become something of a legend. Gentlemen fought for the privilege of partnering her in a dance or engaging her in conversation. She was witty, bold, brilliant, and utterly captivating. One can only imagine, gentle listeners, what might have happened if Lord Blackthorne had not received an invitation to that particular midnight masquerade. But receive one he did, from a friend who promised him an evening unlike any he had experienced in stuffy London ballrooms. The night of the masquerade arrived with a full moon. This author remembers it well, for the moonlight turned the gardens into something from a fairy tale. Lord Blackthorne arrived wearing a simple black domino mask, having no patience for elaborate costumes. He had come out of curiosity more than anything else, still brooding over the peculiar young woman who had ruined his cravat and stammered about astronomy. And then he saw her. She stood near the fountain, engaged in animated discussion with a group of gentlemen, her hands moving expressively as she explained something that had her audience utterly enthralled. The moonlight caught the stars on her mask and the deep blue of her gown, making her appear almost otherworldly. But it was her laugh, free, uninhibited, and genuinely amused, that stopped him in his tracks. This author was positioned perfectly to observe his approach. He moved through the crowd like a man in a dream, drawn by some invisible force. When he finally stood before her, the conversation around her stuttered to a halt. He requested a dance, addressing her as Celeste, having heard one of the gentlemen use that name. She turned to face him fully, and even from my vantage point, I could see the moment of recognition, not of his identity, for the mask concealed that well enough, but of something deeper, that indefinable pull between two souls destined to collide. She challenged him, asking if he could keep up with her dancing, warning that she had been told she danced like someone possessed when the music moved her. He responded that having wrestled pythons in India and outrun tigers in Bengal, he believed he could manage one dance with a mysterious lady. Her response, questioning why only one dance, expressing hope for at least 3 before he admitted defeat, carried a flirtation that would have scandalized anyone who knew the proper Miss Whitmore. Oh, dearest listeners, if only you could have witnessed that first dance. This author nearly required her vinaigrette, and I am not easily moved by such displays. They moved together as if they had been dancing partners all their lives, each anticipating the other's movements with an almost supernatural awareness. But here is where our tale becomes deliciously complicated. For our dear Sophia, as Celeste, had no idea she was dancing with Lord Blackthorn. The mask, the moonlight, and her own preconceptions prevented her from recognizing the very man who had haunted her thoughts since that mortifying tea incident. And the Viscount? He was utterly enchanted by this bold, brilliant creature who challenged him at every turn. She spoke of astronomy with passion, quoted Byron and Shelley, debated the merits of the new Gothic novels with sharp wit, and danced with an abandon that suggested she had never heard of the proper rules governing young ladies' behavior. They danced 3 dances, then 4, scandalous even at a masquerade, and still they continued. Between sets, they walked the moonlit paths, discussing everything from the possibility of life on other planets to the poetry of the Sufi mystics he had encountered in his travels. As they paused beside a grove of silver birch trees, Celeste shared her theory that the moon affects more than just the tides, that it pulls at something in our souls, drawing out our true selves. When he asked if this was her true self, she suggested that perhaps this was who she would be if the world allowed it, then turned the question back on him, asking if he always was himself or if he wore masks even without silk and ribbon. This author must confess to pressing closer to hear his response, nearly giving away my hiding spot behind a convenient hedge. He admitted that he thought he knew who he was until recently, but now found himself questioning everything he thought he wanted. She declared this thrilling, confessing to having existential crises at least twice weekly, usually during particularly tedious afternoon teas. They laughed together in the moonlight, 2 masked figures finding in each other something they hadn't known they were seeking. But then the clock struck 2, and like Cinderella in the fairy tale, our Celeste suddenly remembered who she really was. This author observed the panic that flashed across what was visible of her face. She announced she must leave abruptly, pulling away from him. He caught her hand, begging to know who she was and when he could see her again. She promised only the next month's masquerade, saying if he truly wished to find her, he would be there. And with that, she vanished into the crowd, leaving Lord Blackthorn standing alone in the moonlight, holding only the memory of her touch and the faint scent of lavender. The weeks that followed were torture for all involved. Yes, even for this author, who was forced to watch 2 people absolutely perfect for each other engage in a dance of missed opportunities and misunderstandings. By day, Lord Blackthorn attempted repeatedly to engage Miss Whitmore in conversation. He tried everything, commenting on the weather. She squeaked and fled, asking about her interests. She turned so red he actually asked if she needed a physician, even attempting to discuss books after learning of her love of reading. She dropped an entire stack of volumes on his foot and then nearly fainted from mortification. By night, or rather by moonlight, he waited eagerly for the next masquerade, counting the days like a lovesick schoolboy. This author knows because his valet reported finding him actually marking days off a calendar hidden in his study, something the previously unflappable Viscount would have once considered beneath his dignity. Meanwhile, our dear Sophia was living a double life that would have impressed even the most accomplished spy. By day, she tortured herself with her inability to speak to the man who increasingly occupied her thoughts. She filled 3 journals with all the things she wished she could say to him: witty observations, clever rejoinders, even the occasional bad pun about tea. By night, she dreamed of her mysterious masked gentleman, replaying their conversation, wondering who he might be. She had her suspicions, of course. The height, the build, the way he moved all seemed familiar, but she dismissed them as wishful thinking. Why would someone as magnificent as Lord Blackthorne waste time with Celeste when he could have any woman in London? Finally, the next midnight masquerade arrived. Lord Blackthorne prowled the gardens like a caged panther, having arrived early. He had clearly put effort into his appearance. His black evening clothes were impeccable, his mask slightly more elaborate, highlighting those remarkable blue eyes. Celeste arrived fashionably late, wearing a new mask of silver and stars that made her look like she had descended from the heavens themselves. The moment she entered the garden, the Viscount spotted her. Their reunion was charged with relief and anticipation. As they danced and conversed, he confessed something remarkable. He spoke of a young lady who had upended tea on his cravat and then run away as if he were contagious. He admitted he could not stop thinking about her, despite her stammering and fleeing whenever he approached. He had even heard her refer to him as an astronomical improbability. Yet there was something about her, something in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. A depth, an intelligence, a longing for something more than the narrow life society offered her. Celeste suggested carefully that perhaps the lady was simply shy. Perhaps she became tongue-tied around gentlemen who looked like Greek gods come to life. He turned to her with intensity, asking if she thought that with patience and kindness, this shy creature might reveal her true self. She responded that everyone wears masks, some made of silk and ribbon, others of expectations and fear. But that moonlight has a way of making all masks transparent. When he moved to remove his own mask to test her theory, she stopped him frantically, explaining that if he removed his, she would have to remove hers, and she wasn't ready. This, she gestured to everything around them, was where she could be herself. If he knew who she really was, he insisted it would be impossible for him to be disappointed. He declared her brilliant, bold, and beautiful, certain that whoever she was in daylight, she remained the woman who quoted Rumi, calculated astronomical equations, and danced as if the world were ending. When she asked, startled, how he knew about the equations, he revealed she had been muttering them during their last waltz, something about orbital velocities. But gentle listeners, as anyone who has ever been in love knows, the path of true romance never runs smooth. This author must now relate to you the series of events that very nearly destroyed our lover's happiness before it had even properly begun. The very next day, at Lady Drummond's garden party, fate played a most cruel trick. Lord Blackthorne, still dwelling on his moonlit encounter, was approached by the notorious Lady Miranda Voss, a widow whose beauty was as well known as her dwindling finances. A woman playing the only game society had taught her for survival, making a desperate gamble for a future that was rapidly closing. This author was positioned behind a delightfully concealing rosebush when Lady Voss made her move. She executed a fall into Lord Blackthorne's arms, a maneuver less theatrical than it was a calculated risk born of desperation. She purred her apologies while making no effort to right herself, pressing against him in a manner that would have scandalized even the liberal-minded patronesses of Almack's. And it was at this precise moment, because the universe has a perverse sense of humor, that Miss Sophia Whitmore rounded the hedge. She froze, taking in the scene. Lord Blackthorne with his arms around the beautiful Lady Voss, who was gazing up at him with practiced adoration. To someone who already believed herself unworthy of the Viscount's attention, it was devastating confirmation of every fear she harbored. This author observed the exact moment her heart broke. A small sound, like a wounded bird, escaped her lips. Lord Blackthorne's head snapped up, their eyes met across the garden, and the horror on his face as he realized how the situation must appear was almost comical, if it hadn't been so tragic. He called after her as she fled, but Sophia had already turned and run through the garden, past startled guests, her mother calling after her in confusion. This author, abandoning all pretense of discretion, followed. I found her in Lady Drummond's conservatory, pressed against the glass wall, tears streaming down her face as she stared unseeing at the exotic orchids. She was muttering self-recriminations, berating herself for stupidity, acknowledging that of course he would prefer someone beautiful and confident who could speak in complete sentences. Now, dearest listeners, this author rarely intervenes directly in the affairs she observes, but there are limits to even my professional detachment. I made my presence known, and when Sophia spun around, horrified to be caught in such a state, I gently suggested she was admiring the orchids, though noting that tears were not generally recommended for their care. Through careful conversation, I hinted that I had observed Lord Blackthorn looking like a man who had just watched his world walk away, and that Lady Voss had employed tactics that would make Wellington proud. Most importantly, I suggested that a young woman had run away before the true story could unfold. When she insisted it didn't matter, that someone like her could never interest him, I made a more direct observation about someone very like her having fascinating conversations with someone very like him at certain moonlit gatherings. Her panic confirmed what I suspected. She feared discovery above all else. Outside, we could hear Lord Blackthorn attempting to explain to Mrs. Whitmore that there had been a misunderstanding, that Lady Voss had created a compromising situation, but that his intentions toward her daughter were entirely honorable. When Mrs. Whitmore questioned what intentions he could possibly have toward a daughter who had barely spoken 2 words to him, he responded that perhaps not as Miss Whitmore, but he believed, hoped, that they had more to say to each other than either yet realized. This author watched Sophia's face transform as understanding dawned. He knew. Somehow, he knew. The next 2 weeks, gentle listeners, were agony for all concerned. Sophia avoided Lord Blackthorn with the dedication of a military campaign. She developed sudden illnesses when he was expected at events, discovered urgent needs to visit distant relatives, and once actually hid in a linen closet when he called at her home. The poor Viscount, meanwhile, was going quietly mad. This author has it on good authority that he actually consulted with a detective from Bow Street, trying to discover Celeste's identity, not knowing he already knew it. The detective, after investigation, reported that no such person existed in London society, which only deepened the mystery. But the real tragedy, dearest listeners, was that both parties had decided to sacrifice their happiness for what they believed was the good of the other. Sophia, convinced that Lord Blackthorn's interest in her was mere politeness, and that his heart belonged to the mysterious Celeste, had resolved not to attend the next masquerade. She could not bear, she wrote in her diary, to deceive him further, to make him fall in love with someone who didn't really exist. Lord Blackthorn, meanwhile, had come to a different but equally noble and misguided conclusion. He believed that Celeste was some lady of reduced circumstances, perhaps a governess or companion, who could only taste freedom at these masquerades. He resolved to find her and offer her marriage, to give her the freedom to be herself always, not knowing that the prison holding her was of her own making. The night of the final masquerade arrived with storm clouds gathering. How atmospheric! The garden was transformed with Chinese lanterns swaying in the rising wind, creating moving shadows that made everything seem alive with possibility. Lord Blackthorn arrived first, pacing the main pavilion with barely contained energy. He had clearly prepared for this night. This author noticed he carried a small velvet box in his pocket, the shape unmistakably that of a ring box. The dear man had come prepared to propose to a woman whose face he had never seen. But as the hours passed and Celeste did not appear, his agitation grew. He questioned every woman in a mask, growing more desperate as each proved not to be his mysterious lady. Finally, near midnight, he stood alone by the fountain where they had first danced, the picture of dejection. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore residence, Sophia sat in her room, still in her night rail, the star-covered mask in her hands. She had been sitting thus for hours, a battle raging within her. One voice, the familiar, timid whisper of Miss Whitmore told her to stay hidden, to spare herself the humiliation and him the disappointment. It argued that he was in love with a fantasy, a woman of starlight who did not exist in the harsh light of day. But another voice, stronger and clearer than she had ever heard it before, the voice of Celeste, argued back. It spoke not of fantasy, but of truth, hiding now, allowing him to believe that the woman who debated science and quoted poetry was nothing more than a fleeting dream, was the greater deception. The greatest deception was not the mask, but the silence that would follow. She realized with a startling clarity that to deny him the truth was to betray not only him, but herself, and the brilliant woman she knew she was capable of being. With a determination that seemed to settle deep in her bones, she rose. She would go, not to win him, but to be honest. She would give him the truth of who she was, even if it meant losing him forever. With deliberate hands, she began to dress, not in the elaborate costume of Celeste, but in a simple evening gown of midnight blue, the most daring thing she owned, with its slightly lower neckline and absence of ruffles. It was not a costume for Celeste, nor a shield for Sophia. It was a gown for herself. She arrived at the masquerade just as the clock struck midnight, carrying her mask but not wearing it. The wind had risen to dramatic heights, sending her hair flying about her face in a most becoming manner. Lord Blackthorn stood with his back to her at the fountain, and this author watched as our dear Sophia gathered every ounce of courage she possessed. She approached him slowly, and when she was but 3 feet away, she spoke. Not words of love or explanation, but the orbital velocity calculations she had been muttering during their last waltz. The effect on Lord Blackthorn was electric. He spun around so quickly he nearly toppled into the fountain. The expression on his face when he saw her, truly saw her, was something this author shall treasure forever. It was recognition, relief, joy, and desire, all mingled into one perfect moment of understanding. What followed, dearest listeners, was a scene worthy of the finest poetry, though this author shall endeavor to describe it in prose. Lord Blackthorn stood frozen for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, his eyes traveling from Sophia's unmasked face to the star-covered mask clutched in her trembling hands. Then, with a movement so gentle it brought tears to this cynical author's eyes, he reached out and took the mask from her, letting it fall forgotten to the ground. He told her he had known, or at least suspected, since their second meeting at the masquerade. The way she had tilted her head when thinking, a particular turn of phrase about stellar distances, the fact that she had stumbled slightly on the same garden stone, both as Sophia fleeing Lady Harrington's tea and as Celeste leaving the first masquerade, all these small details had painted a picture his heart recognized, even if his mind had doubted. Sophia, for her part, began what would have been a lengthy apology and explanation, but Lord Blackthorn stopped her with a gentle finger to her lips. He understood, he assured her. He understood the weight of expectations, the fear of not being enough, the desperate desire to be seen for who one truly was rather than what society expected. Then, in a gesture that had the gathering crowd, for yes, gentle listeners, their reunion had attracted quite an audience, gasping in collective delight, he dropped to one knee right there by the fountain. The velvet box appeared in his hand, and inside, a ring that featured not a traditional diamond, but a star sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds arranged like constellations. He had commissioned it, he explained, after their first dance, knowing that whoever his mysterious Celeste was, she was a woman who belonged among the stars. He asked her to marry him, not as Celeste, not as the shy Miss Whitmore society knew, but as herself, the brilliant, complex, wonderful combination of both. Sophia's acceptance came not in words. She was crying too hard for that, but in the way she fell to her knees beside him, not caring that her gown would be ruined by the damp ground, and threw her arms around his neck. The kiss that followed was definitely not proper by any standards of the day, but the assembled crowd erupted in applause anyway. But wait, dearest listeners, for the best part is yet to come. As the newly engaged couple finally rose, assisted by several helpful and emotional onlookers, Mrs. Whitmore burst through the crowd, somehow alerted to the unfolding drama. This author can only speculate as to how. She took one look at the scene, Her daughter with her hair completely disheveled, grass stains on her best gown, tears streaming down her face, but smiling as she had never smiled before, and Lord Blackthorn looking at her as if she had hung the very stars she so loved to study, and did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She laughed, then she cried, then she laughed again, declaring that she had been wondering when Sophia would finally stop sneaking out to these masquerades and simply tell the truth. Oh yes, gentle listeners, mothers always know more than they let on. The wedding, I am delighted to report, was held 3 months later on a clear night when Venus was at its brightest. The bride wore a gown embroidered with constellations in silver thread, and the groom gave his vows not just to Sophia, but to Celeste as well, promising to love all the facets of the remarkable woman he had chased through moonlight and found in sunshine. Their wedding breakfast featured an astronomical theme, with tables named after planets and a wedding cake decorated with sugar-craft stars. Lord Blackthorn's wedding gift to his bride? A private observatory built on their country estate, where she could study her beloved stars and be exactly who she was, brilliant, bold, and occasionally still shy enough to blush when he looked at her a certain way. This author has it on good authority that their first child, born exactly 9 months and 3 days after the wedding, one does keep track of these things, was named Celeste. And yes, she inherited her mother's golden eyes and her father's midnight hair, along with a tendency to be quite verbose in the nursery, but mysteriously silent in company, until she discovered her own metaphorical mask at the age of 16. But that, dearest listeners, is a story for another time. And so, gentle listeners, another tale reaches its blessed conclusion. Two souls who might have remained forever separate, divided by fear and misunderstanding, were united by the transformative power of moonlight and the courage to finally step into the sun. This author withdraws until our next encounter. Until then, remember, the greatest scandals often lead to the greatest happiness, and sometimes the most spectacular love stories begin with spilled tea and orbital velocity calculations. Your devoted chronicler, Lady Ravenswood.